Hi, my name is Jim Goddard. I'm the chair of the Care Leavers Association. I'm going to be talking about how we prioritise care experience accounts in historical research. More relevant for this presentation is not so much me being chair of the CLA, but actually being a retired academic with a strong interest in the history of the care system. I'm going to be talking about two things. First of all, as you can see there, I'm going to be talking about a variety of sources for care experience voices and really encouraging people to engage with them and just appreciate that they're there and they can be sought out. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about how we might want to use these sources and some of the issues, the methodological issues around using them. And I have included a few references. I'll explain the point of them as we go through the rest of the presentation. Firstly, just to introduce a note of complexity, here's three very famous people brought up in care, all of whom wrote autobiographical accounts of their childhood in care, and all of whom had those accounts questioned by later biographers after they died. In the references, I put the autobiographical accounts and the biographical accounts, and I just encourage people to read them if they get a chance, just to try to work out what's going on here. And I'll say no more than that because we haven't really got time to go into the complexities of this, but I thought it was worth starting with that, just to encourage people to think. Here we've got a range of both autobiographical and biographical sources on care experience. There are increasing numbers of celebrity autobiographies and biographies of growing up in care. This is a very, very small selection of the ones that are available, and also autobiographies and biographies of care experienced people who are not that well known, but they're also useful sources, obviously from a very individual point of view. I'll come back to that point at the end. There are also as well collections, edited collections, some by care experienced editors, others not. The three I put on there are probably the most useful starting points here. Rebecca Pierre's Freeloads on Fridays is the most recent, and Rebecca's talked about that in her own presentation, so I won't say more about that here. Lisa Cherry's third edition of The Brightness of Stars is particularly interesting because she invites the authors who first wrote for her to reflect on their original entries, so you get a sense of how an account of growing up in care can change as we age. That's particularly interesting. And Mary Carter and Siobhan McLean's Insiders Outsiders arose from the growing awareness that there are large numbers of social workers who were in care as children. So that book specifically allows those people, those individuals, to explore the relationship between their care experience and their adult lives. Beyond that, there are a whole range of other sources. There's what you might call standard historical sources, such as the books by Annie Skinner and Claudia Suarez, which very helpfully use letters from children and young adults as primary material in their accounts. There are also less well-known, what you might call professional accounts. Noel Tim's The Receiving End, for example, contains short essays written by adults who've been in care as children. Marjorie Allen's pamphlet from 1946, Whose Children? I'll come back to that later on. I think it's the next slide, actually. Other forms of material. Again, the Who Cares pamphlets from 1977. I'll come back to that in a later slide. One of my favourite books on this subject, Pamela Mann's 1984 book, Children in Care Revisited, Pamela Mann was a social worker who then became an academic, and about a decade after she'd finished as a social worker, she went back to interview some of her former clients, and each chapter is based on an interview with one or more of her former clients, and it's a book that's well worth engaging with. And beyond that, of course, we also have increasingly surveys of the views of children in care, and they're often published and widely disseminated. Official surveys from bodies like the Children's Commissioner, but also lots of charities and academics also engage in survey work, and have been doing so for the last 2 or 3 decades. So I want to look at what I've called as, I put uncensored voices question mark, because although I like the way these voices are prioritised, I don't want to make assumptions about the choices that are made to prioritise certain voices. Marjorie Allen's 1946 pamphlet arose simply as a result of her letter to the Times of 1944. Quite a famous letter because it started the debate that eventually led to the Curtis Committee and the 1948 Children Act. As a result of Allen's letter, loads of people wrote to her, and there could be adults who'd been in care as children, the parents of children who'd been in care, and in some cases professionals and non-professionals who'd worked in the system, effectively whistleblowing. And Allen used, by permission, as many of those letters as she could as the basis for a pamphlet. This example, which you can read as I'm speaking, was produced by a young woman. She was 22 when she wrote, talking about her time in the care system, and as you can see, it's quoted at quite at length, and gives a very direct sense of what it was like in the children's homes that she lived in. Here's a good example of authors, in this case 2 authors or 2 editors, trying to give a lot of room for the unfiltered voice of young people. It's the 1977 Who Cares pamphlet. The authors worked with a group of young people. There was 18 of them, 14 who were in care, and 4 adults who'd been in care, who basically worked as a kind of focus group for a year, writing this booklet about life in care. And if you look at the 4 first entries from the Charter of Rights, you get a real sense that the authors did what they said they did in the other clip there, which is try to give the young people as much free rein to write in their own voice as possible, because those rights wouldn't simply not have been written, I don't believe, in that language. That's not professional language. It's the language of young people, and unfortunately, we haven't got the background papers for that very important pamphlet. They were destroyed. But if you read the rest of the pamphlet as well, it is written in that style, and you do have a very real sense that the 2 editors had a very, very light touch and acted primarily as facilitators for the voices of the young people involved. Since then, there have been a number of initiatives which have led to quite a significant volume of publications by children in care and care leavers. NAPIC from the 1980s produced an awful lot of really, really interesting work, some of which is still freely available. The Black and in Care Conference Report, which is a really, really excellent conference report, produced by a steering group. These were collective documents, and I'll come back to that point at the end in terms of their usefulness. And since then, bodies like a National Voice from the late 1990s onwards and the Care Leave Association have also produced reports, documents of various kinds from a care experience perspective. So how do we make sense of all these different sources, and what should we think about them? I've just put a few pointers there of things to consider. As I mentioned, we've looked at grassroots voices. Social policy traditionally tends to focus on elites. In fact, history focuses on elites. In the last 30, 40 years, there's been a lot more focus on the views of, for example, minorities of different kinds. And care leavers are just, when children in care are part of that. We need to make a distinction between individual voices and collective voices. For example, the pamphlet that I showed you earlier. Collective voices, different people will have more dominant say than other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that's a problem. All groups will have more and less dominant voices. But we need to recognise that collective voices are very different from, it's not the sum total of individual voices, it's something quite different. Secondly, all literature, even the letters written in the late 19th century by children in care to charities, there's a bias towards the literate. That's why we don't have accounts that go back, certainly not that I'm aware of, more than a couple of hundred years. There's also a bias towards the cooperative. We hear from young people who want to write, who choose to write, who choose to sit down and put pen to paper, who choose to be interviewed, and many will not. So we cannot in any sense assume that the documents we get are somehow representative. They are representative in a sense of, for example, some of the issues in the care system. The 1977 pamphlet is quite good on highlighting issues that professionals, for example, would not have been aware of, but young people were. But we need to be careful about recognising the number of voices that are not part of this discussion. Likewise, there's a bias towards people who are aware and connected to some of these initiatives. Who hears about these events, these opportunities to have your voice raised? There's also the issue not just of censorship in terms of authors prioritising and denying certain voices, but also self-censorship, which links into the next point. That, for example, if you think about the letters written to charities by children in care, some of these may well have been very honest, but the awareness of your intended audience will inevitably, and it does for all of us, shape what you write. So in looking at historical material, we always need to think about who was the audience for this, and how does that shape what's written. Another point is that most of the information that we are reading now, well, not most of it, but quite a bit of it actually, certainly the information held by charities and other bodies, was assumed to be for a very limited audience, and other than that, to be largely secret. 21st century and modern technology is starting to erode that assumption of secrecy in all sorts of areas, and limited audiences. A further point is that we have a growing number, of what we've had them since the 1980s, of audio-visual voices, audio recordings, video clips of interviews with people who are in care, and they're useful as well alongside written accounts because they give different access to different voices. Another point, and this is where we get slightly more methodological, is just to consider, when we look at this material, the value of what's called insider research. Some of this comes from work on social class and the value of working class researchers, for example, researching social class and working class social mobility, as opposed to middle class and upper class researchers. What effect does having somebody with an, if you like, inside identity and knowledge, what effect does that have on the responses that are given? And I put a couple of sources that are particularly good on that, in terms of you get a real sense that the working class voice of the researcher made a big difference to what they got back from their respondents. And it's very easy to apply some of those lessons to the value of having care experience researchers talking to care experience interviewees and engaging in survey work, for example. And finally, a few further references. If you do want to engage with methodology, particularly around historical research. Yeah, that's enough on that one. There are the references. Hopefully some of those will be helpful if you're interested in this area. There's a lot of work still to be done on the history of the care system. And if you're as obsessed with the history of the care system as I am, or you just have any questions, there's my email address. So thank you for your time.